All right, students, today we're going to discuss the bureaucracy. Of course, we've already went over the executive branch in terms of the presidency, and the president, of course, being a single person, can't very well carry out all the duties of the presidency without some assistance, and that's where the bureaucracy comes in, which sort of refers to the departments and agencies and the people who work for the president to help the president carry out all their responsibilities and the work of the government in general.
All right, this slide gives you just a definition of the bureaucracy. So you can see it's very large, it's very complex, that these people are professionals, they're non-elected officials. Their main job is to, like Mr. Davila said, to carry out the laws. So the president is the head of the executive branch, but of course he can't run the federal government, which is which is basically the biggest employer in the United States. And so sometimes you'll see terms like civil servants instead of bureaucrats. I don't know if there's any other terms they might see, but anyway, so many of these people are lifetime. They serve. This is their job. They serve over the course of multiple presidencies, and so they gain expertise and knowledge that hopefully makes for a better government. And you can see that the bureaucracy is enormous, but our government is enormous, and our country is a major world power, and the government does a lot of good things for the people, so it needs a lot of people to help carry out its functions. And so now many of these bureaucratic agencies fall within one of the major cabinet departments, the 15 cabinet departments. The largest of those is the Department of Defense, which you can see has nearly 3 million employees and is the largest employer in the world. So that just gives you a sense of how big some of these agencies are.
Don't forget, students, that as Mr. Phillipps mentioned, the United States is a very large country. It is in fact the third largest country in terms of population in the world, with 300 plus million people. So while it does appear on the face of it that 3 million people working for the Defense Department, or if you just tallied up the number of non-military civil servants, that actually I think also is close to 3 million. But when you consider the fact that we have the third most populous country in the world with 300 plus million people and growing, then you may get a better sense for why we have that number in place. This graphic is very illustrative because it shows you that the term bureaucracy is meant to communicate something about its function or how it functions and how it's arranged. As you can see here, you see several individuals at desks, and the word bureaucracy comes from the French sort of interpretation of the word bureau, which refers to a desk, if you will. And indeed, bureaucracy literally means rule by desks. So you can probably imagine that the overwhelming majority of the work that's done by bureaucrats is paperwork that is completed at a desk. So this graphic conveys that. In addition to the type of work that's being done at desks and paperwork, you can also see that there is a hierarchy, and that's another telltale sign of a bureaucracy, is a hierarchical organization that means to get its work done through paperwork and desk work. We'll go into more detail about this later. Here you can see a list of characteristics of the bureaucracy. Indeed, you can see that the bureaucrats are charged with administering the government, basically carrying out the responsibilities and duties of the government. Again, as Mr. Phillipps already mentioned, and it is also worth noting, once again, that these bureaucrats are indeed individuals who have sought these jobs as a career. They are professionals. They are not elected individuals. There's also the issue of task specialization. So, and that sort of dovetails with the prior component or characteristic that I just mentioned here, and that is that these individuals are highly trained, but the way a bureaucracy is set up, sometimes there are excessive numbers of steps. And of course, I can be facetious here and tell you, someone is solely responsible, for example, to put stamps on a letter, to be sent out. Now, that's not indeed a job in and of itself, but it's often been caricatured or made fun of, the bureaucracy that is, by having an excessive focus on individual tasks. Now, of course, the benefit of task specialization is that you're really, really good at that one thing. But the drawback or the disadvantage is that because of this sort of myopic focus or narrow focus on just one task, that you don't really see the bigger picture, that you aren't able to really adapt your skill set to another, if you will, function, that your skill set is just so narrowly tailored to just one area that you don't really have a skill set that's transferable to other areas. And you can imagine what kind of problems that could pose. In addition, the hierarchical authority or nature of the bureaucracy, you can see this, of course, as a benefit because it helps to maintain organization and a clear chain of command, that you know who you report to or who oversees who. But again, at times this isn't always too clear, and plus the hierarchical nature of things being so rigid means that having to follow a certain chain of command always may not be the most efficient way to get something done. Now, another characteristic of the bureaucracy is that the members who, of course, are in the bureaucracy, the people working in the bureaucracy, should be impersonal, meaning that they should not show any bias or preference when they are carrying out their job or responsibilities. So if you are going to a bureaucrat for a particular service, it should never come up if you're a Democrat or a Republican, or if you're a woman or a man. In other words, those characteristics should never matter. The only thing that should matter is if you are indeed a citizen who qualifies for the service and how that bureaucrat means to get that service to you, and if, of course, the funds are available. But this is a very important part of our bureaucracy because in the past, prior to, if you will, the 1900s, well, really the late 1800s, we saw a really awful situation result where we had a tremendous amount of corruption in our bureaucracy, where people would give out favors only to those people who would in turn vote, for the people who put them in positions of power. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later with respect to the spoils system and patronage. But nonetheless, suffice it to say that maintaining impersonality in the bureaucracy is a very important thing in terms of making sure that it runs fairly and that it runs professionally. You notice here as well that bureaucrats are inclined to follow rigid or complex procedures. Again, the hierarchical nature of this entity makes it that the persons who work in this entity are perhaps much more inclined to only work within a certain set of parameters that are set out, because the bureaucracy does not reward innovation or thinking outside the box. It very much is fill out this paperwork, make sure you follow this procedure, make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's. In other words, every detail needs to be followed and then every sort of procedure needs to be completed in order to get something done. Obviously, by having an excessive focus on these rigid and complex rules, this is going to stifle effectiveness and innovation. In other words, there's not as much flexibility built into the process to find new ways, better ways to do things. And that would lead to red tape, which we'll talk about later. But red tape, generally speaking, broadly speaking, refers to the excessive amount of regulations or steps and procedures that constituent or a citizen would need to go through in order to get a particular service. So there's tons of paperwork to fill out. That kind of stuff would be red tape.
Okay, so this chart shows a couple of things here. This would be the Department of Justice, one of the 15 cabinet departments, which we'll come back to later. But you can see the hierarchical nature of these departments, and a lot of people think, maybe mistakenly think that the Department of Justice is sort of just one building that is in Washington, and the people who work there, they head up the Department of Justice. But so the Department of Justice is mainly, their main mission is to enforce the laws of the United States. But you see that the agencies are very, it's a very complex hierarchical structure with many different agencies, and these agencies are going to also have offices throughout the country. Now you see the Attorney General at the top. This also is the only head of a cabinet department that's not called Secretary of. So the Attorney General is one of the original offices created with George Washington. You see there's also a Deputy Attorney General, an Associate Attorney General, and you see this, who would report to who. The Solicitor General has an interesting job. Their main job is to basically represent the United States government when the United States government is in court, especially during the appeals process. If a case involving the United States government is appealed to the higher courts, especially the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General's office would represent the United States government. Whereas you see the U.S. attorneys, the office of the U.S. attorney is down there on the sort of about right in the middle on the bottom, near the bottom. U.S. attorneys serve throughout the country. Their job is to prosecute federal crimes or people accused of federal crimes. You also see the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the FBI, one of the better known government law enforcement agencies really in the world. You see the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And anyway, so you see all these law enforcement agencies, but you also see, the Antitrust Division, which would handle prosecutions of, potential abuse by corporations and monopolies and things like that. So there's just, many agencies, and all the agencies also, you notice, where is it? The Office of the Inspector General on the right. Mm-hmm. And so those are sort of the watchdogs within an agency that kind of make sure, they investigate any wrongdoing, or they kind of make sure that people in the agency are following the rules. And so each department, cabinet department, would also have an inspector general.
So what exactly do bureaucrats do? And so we've mentioned this a little bit already, but I want to drive home the point that bureaucrats, they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for implementing the laws. In other words, making the laws operational, come to life. I've mentioned before in class that when Congress passes a law, the law itself is sort of a general broad statement of a principle or a goal or guidelines for meeting a certain goal. And ultimately, the Congress will look or give the responsibility to the bureaucrats to then create the rules and regulations that actually then make this law come to life. Now, of course, they often have, the bureaucrats do some flexibility in how they craft these rules and regulations, and typically this is where we're going to see presidents try to take advantage of that flexibility so as to interpret the law in a way that conforms to their agenda. And this would be an area of friction. Remember, this is one of the things we want to stress throughout this unit, is that when we see friction or areas of overlap with respect to the jurisdiction of both branches, both the executive and legislative branches, we want you to pay attention to what areas, what points in the process could there potentially be areas of confrontation or conflict. And this would be one of those areas. In other words, when bureaucrats are given the responsibility to make rules and regulations, the Congress is generally trusting that these bureaucrats are going to make rules and regulations that are consistent with what their intent was. However, of course, the president is the one who oversees these bureaucrats, and will often give them directions that are consistent with what he wants to see or how he wants to see a law implemented. And so these rules and regulations can sometimes, or in some cases oftentimes, will show up in court, especially when there's a disagreement between the two branches with respect to how to carry out a particular law.
And I think now is as good a time as any to mention that there's also rules in place about how these agencies can make their rules. So Congress has put rules in place that says, if they implement a new regulation or rule, there's often a waiting period where there's a chance for public input, from the industries that might be regulated. For example, a new regulation on farmers or something. And so they would have, by the Department of Agriculture, they would have time to give public feedback. And so I think there's like a 60-day waiting period or something like that for each regulation. Anyway, once the time period has elapsed, and then that regulation would go into effect, most likely, then it's added into this document called the Federal Register. And so if you operate a business or you're a farmer or whatever, you have to make sure you stay in compliance with these different regulations. And so, maybe we'll have time in class or something, but if you look at the Federal Register, it's really quite amazing that you can just look over the course of like a week and how many new regulations you would see, published there, and it's just pretty awe-inspiring to just because the government again is just so big and they regulate so many things in our society. This slide, we're not going to spend a lot of time, but again, it gives you a breakdown of approximately what percentage of workers work in these different departments, and you can see Department of Defense is the largest cabinet agency, as we mentioned.
The Office of Personnel Management is the office responsible for hiring the persons who work in the bureaucracy, and this is a really important office indeed. I think historically, the fact that this office, remember I told you that prior to the turn of the century, if you will, around the 1900s, prior to that point, the late 1800s, was a really low point, a nadir, if you will, in our politics because it was one of the most corrupt times in our history with respect to how the government worked. In other words, oftentimes the positions in the bureaucracy were given to people who were close to the president's friends of the president or friends of people the president knew. In other words, they were given to people based on who they knew, not on what they knew, which meant you're going to have very inefficient running of government and a government that only caters to certain people who indeed, if you will, agree with the current administration and their viewpoints. And this creates a lot of division and factionalism, and obviously we mentioned corruption. It really came to a head when one civil servant felt like they deserved to have a position in this new administration. It was Garfield's, I think, administration that, in other words, what happens at the end is that he figured, hey, I didn't get the job that I was owed, so naturally, what should I do? Oh, yes, assassinate the president. Congress then decides, perhaps having a civil service system set up based on just giving people who, if you will, are friends of the president or just based on patronage, if you will, a quid pro quo, a tit for tat, is not the best setup, right? I mean, shocking, right? Shocking reality. Something that was clearly already understood by the Chinese thousands of years ago, because we get the idea of a civil service system. That means a professional run government from the Chinese, essentially. They established that 1,000+ years ago. And here we are relearning this lesson that essentially when you have a government with a lot of people in it that don't really know what they're doing, that are incompetent, that are solely there because of who they know, you're going to have a lot of problems. And so we'll talk about an act that's going to be passed on the heels of the assassination of Garfield, I believe, right, Mr. Phillips? I'm pretty certain. Garfield, who was assassinated again by a civil servant who thought he was owed a position, essentially. But nowadays, so after that, it was called the Pendleton Act, or the Civil Service Act. Now you have to actually pass a test in order to become a bureaucrat or in order to work in the bureaucracy. The test is there obviously to make sure that you are competent in what field you wish to go into, but that you are also emotionally and mentally stable. They do have some questions sometimes that lend themselves to sort of your state of mind. But nonetheless, the idea here is that nowadays bureaucrats have to show that they're competent in the area or field that they're working in. Now, while I say the bureaucrats do, that does not mean that the heads of these agencies have to be competent in their particular department, because the heads of these agencies are still going to be appointed by the president. But at least the workers who are working in these departments, they are supposed to have demonstrated already competency in order to be working there. Okay. Anything you want to add? Okay.
So this just shows you the breakdown of the federal bureaucracy. So it's typically much more representative of society as a whole than our elected leaders are. And anyway, so you can look at that, but it's pretty reflective of the overall workforce. This diagram shows you some of the occupations. Again, not something we're going to spend a lot of time on, but it is interesting to note the variety of occupations that you see. Many of the workers, as Mr. Davila mentioned at the beginning, many of these workers would sit behind desks, right? Rule by desk. So you see a lot of analysts and purchase agents and clerks and secretaries. So I mean, there's a lot of paperwork, and to just think about the fact that someone has to order stuff for the government to operate. I mean, imagine, people have to pay bills. There's government buildings, U.S. government buildings all over the country, right? There's people who have to order copy paper and, computers. And I mean, it's just mind-boggling when you think of, just the vastness again of the government. But you also notice that here there's a lot of professionals, people who are highly trained, and the government has to always work around the fact that they don't offer as much money as maybe private industry, and so that's a good pitch there for raising salaries for government workers like teachers who are also need salary increases anyway. But you see there's computer specialists, engineers, scientists. So think about someone who works for the Environmental Protection Agency or the Center for Disease Control, which is in Atlanta. Some of these people are highly trained, PhDs, and just
exceptionally qualified.
Yes. So, and lawyers who work for the government and again making less money than they would in private industry.
As mentioned before, the bureaucrats have to and are trained to follow sets of procedures that the agencies use to make these decisions. And, the virtue of having to follow a certain set of procedures is that, well, you're not likely then to find people trying to cut corners only for some people and not other people, trying to do favors for some and not other people. So you can say it's virtuous, right? Because on the one hand, maybe it gives you some sense that everyone's going to have to go through the same set of rules and regulations and paperwork in order to get something from the government. So there's uniformity of the application, or if you will, the implementation of the law and or the meting out of services. However, of course, it's extraordinarily frustrating because this creates what we call red tape. Red tape refers to the excessive rules and regulations that you have to go through in order to get a service, right? And as you can see from this picture over here, it sort of shows you that this is obviously not a positive thing. It's rather negative, right? People have very upset. Citizens typically get very frustrated. Some don't even then try to pursue getting services because there's so much red tape, they figure it's just not worth their time, which is very troubling indeed, because ultimately the government is there to, of course, serve the people and make certain the people are getting the services they need. Mr. Phillips, you want to add something?
Yes, found this joke online. So it says, sure sign of a bureaucracy is when the first person who answers the phone can't help you. So, like, you get that message, oh, sorry, you have the wrong department. I'll connect you with the other. And you've already been on hold for 15 or 20 minutes. Or think about, this is more local or state bureaucracy. But if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, most people don't say, oh, wow, that was such a great experience. Or, I know for me personally, my daughter gets some government help. She has special needs, so we get a packet from the state of Georgia every year, to reapply for her benefits, and it's like a packet of like 100 papers, to fill out, and we have to take this one to the doctor, and this one to her therapist, and this one to her school, and then we have to fill out this, and then there's all these things, your privacy is being protected, and all. Anyway, but I mean, it just in the detail of the paperwork, we're like, oh my gosh, how does anyone fill these out? You practically do need an advanced college degree to figure out some of these complicated forms. And so the next few slides really capture, maybe the essence of bureaucracy, which is, the bureaucrats wield a tremendous amount of power, and some people complain about this because, again, they're not elected, but it's like, what else are we going to do? Because the Congress passes laws, but they give them administrative discretion. I think there's another term that they like.
Discretionary authority.
Yeah, discretionary authority. So you'll see these different terms. Remember, discretion sort of like, you're kind of given choice, right? You're given leeway in how you do something. So if we said, hey, you guys can, read this chapter or either listen to the PowerPoint, we'll leave it up to your discretion. That would be saying like, we're leaving it up to your own choice. And so bureaucrats are given this flexibility and the choice when Congress passes a law on how to best implement it. Because remember, again, they're the experts. And so imagine, Congress is trying to make a complicated law to protect clean air or clean water, but they have no idea, what chemicals are safe or not safe to be in water, or the degree, amount of particles of certain chemicals that might be okay or not okay.
Even though some of them try to pretend like they know these things when they don't.
And you hear that a lot, like when members of Congress are saying, well, I don't know about climate change. I'm not a scientist, and I'm like, exactly, you're not a scientist, so leave it up to the scientists. But so these people, or imagine again, just it's the Department of Defense, and the president wants this new, like Reagan had his Star Wars plan for Star Wars. Now we have Trump with the Space Force, and presidents come up with these bold plans, but can that actually be done? And can we actually have a system that do we have the technology to shoot down enemy missiles with lasers like Dr. Evil or something, lasers. And, so the defense experts and weapons experts might say, well, Mr. President, I know you want to get this done, but it's really not something that we can do. And if we spend all this money, it's really, we're probably going to be, just wasting it because, this system won't work or we don't have the technology. So a lot of times Congress will make the laws pretty vague on purpose and leave it up to these agencies to decide how to best carry out the law.
So this slide is showing you one of the more influential political philosophers who advocated for an idea that the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy actually were a good thing, that essentially a good government is a government that has a good bureaucracy or a robust and well-functioning bureaucracy. Alex Weber in particular, what he's going to suggest here is that the political process is controlled by political elites in the bureaucracy. So it's going to be both descriptive rather. In other words, he's describing how the government in the U.S. is actually working or should work. And indeed, sorry, I should just say is working because that's descriptive, but it's also prescriptive. Alex Weber is going to make the argument that this is actually ideal, that in essence, we shouldn't be alarmed by the fact that the bureaucrats, essentially the professional, and another way of referencing to bureaucrats is professional government workers, so that we really shouldn't be concerned that our government's being run, essentially by professional government workers, and because they have expertise and they're going to act in a way that is not partisan or biased per se, that it's going to be based on qualifications and the rules and the regulations, and people will be treated fairly, and it's based on whether or not you qualify. For all these reasons, Alex Weber says, then it's a good thing. Not only am I describing how the government's actually working under our model, the U.S. model, but in fact, this is how it should run. And you can see here what he envisions as sort of the model of the bureaucrats being in hierarchical authority structure, task specialization. They operate on the merit principle. I really want you to look up the word merit so that you're not thrown off by it, okay? Because this is a term that will come up over and over again, and I feel like it's likely that many of you will trip over this word if you don't actually go ahead and look it up. But merit just means based on your actual work, and so that your work will get you reward. In other words, that your work is or your competency is what's going to allow you to be promoted. So it's based on what you know, if you will. Behaving with impersonality, I already talked about this, how that's a good thing, that you don't want bureaucrats deciding who to give services to based on whether or not they like you, or based on whether or not you're of their same race, or you're of their same gender, or their same party, that essentially that they should not be biased, that they should be impersonal when they are interacting with the public and making decisions about benefits and services.
Okay, so we found this example to give credit. I can't remember who, but we found this on one of our share sites with AP Government. So I'm not going to take credit, but we put this together. We thought it was a good example. So you could give thousands of examples on this, so let's look at an example of administrative discretion. So in this case, Congress, the issue is that people
or discretionary authority. I mean, and yeah. I just want to say that just because that may be how you see it on a test or an exam. Discretionary authority and administrative discretion are the same thing.
Right. So imagine, workplace safety has always been an issue that we've had to deal with, and different times in our history it has been basically ignored. So there was more calls by unions and workers for Congress to act to make the workplaces more safe for workers. And so they passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. And as you can see, it was supposed to protect the safety and health of workers. But for a couple of reasons. So Congress couldn't agree on, because we'll talk later about interest groups and lobbyists. And of course, corporate interests are very powerful, and they give a lot of money to members of Congress to help them get elected. And so you can imagine that they, workplace, the employers, corporations don't really want these increased regulations because it's going to cost them money to comply, and it's just more headaches for them. But of course, from the workers' standpoint, they want these safety regulations, and they want to make sure that they're not being overworked and so forth, and that they're not being mistreated. So they get breaks and things like that, and that they're not getting injured on the job from dangerous work conditions. So Congress was getting pressure from both sides. So part of it, for political reasons, they sort of passed the buck in a lot of these cases. They'll punt and kick the can down the road, whatever cliche you want to use, to the bureaucratic agencies. It sort of shows Congress is in a way sort of cowardly, but also it shows that they don't really know how to put these, how to make the detail that's necessary to make these laws work. And so Congress would say, what should we do about this? And so here's what they did. So as part of the law, they also create the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is often referred to as OSHA, based on the acronym. So this was added into the Department of Labor, which is one of the cabinet departments. And they have authority to make rules that specify regulations that companies must follow for workplace safety. And so if you go to any workplace, you should see these OSHA posters on the wall. They're required to post these safety regulations. But so that they're allowed to make rules. So in essence, they are really, that's where the real power is in a lot of cases, right? Because Congress sets out a broad goal, but in this case, you have the executive or bureaucratic agency that actually makes it happen, and they're the ones, essentially. Then they're making law, right? They're really making the regulations that companies have to follow. And so, of course, there's an ongoing battle about government and the role of government, because on one hand, you want to protect the citizens, you want to protect the workers, but on the other hand, corporations sometimes are frustrated by all the rules that they have to follow. So this is part of our ongoing political debate.
In addition to making rules and regulations, bureaucrats or bureaucratic agencies also have the ability to adjudicate. In other words, to make determinations about whether or not someone was in violation of a rule or regulation. So essentially, you can liken this to what judges do, right? Or what the judiciary does. They stand in judgment. You notice the root word in adjudication here is judgment, or to judge. And essentially, it allows the agencies to settle disputes like a court might. And for example, with OSHA, if there was a dispute between an employer and an employee about whether or not the employer indeed was complying with the rules, the employee could bring, if you will, the case before, or if you will, could bring the case before OSHA for the fine or some sort of ruling. Now, it's typically the case that when an incident arises, you first must go to the bureaucratic agency, and then they will issue a ruling. However, if either party, either the employer or employee, in this case with OSHA, disagrees with the ruling, they can also go to court and challenge it there. But you first have to go through the bureaucratic agency and get a ruling from them, where they then have the power to adjudicate. I think it's really telling at this moment, if we step back, one of the arguments in political science circles is that the bureaucracy is actually an extraordinarily powerful entity. Why? Because this entity, not only are they in charge of ultimately implementing the law, but they really have powers that are typical of all the other three branches. In other words, they are there to execute the law. We know that because they're ultimately responsible for carrying out the law, right? Enforcement of the law. That's their primary domain. But they also have discretionary authority, which essentially allows them to engage in what is like lawmaking, right? They get to make up these rules and regulations so as to make the law come to life. But they also get to adjudicate, which is like what the judiciary does. So this is really important, and I hope you've noted this already, that the bureaucracy really has functions or powers that really span all three branches, that allow it to act in a functional way like all three of the branches of government. So that's worth noting, and it also gives you insight as to how important and consequential this entity is.
Right. So again, just to bring that issue or that point home, so you see again that in this case you might have a dispute over employees who are fined for workplace safety violations. They could take that to OSHA and appeal it. Ultimately, though, these cases can be appealed to the federal court. So there is some check. We'll talk about some of the checks that the other branches have on the bureaucracy. It's not like they do have a lot of power, but they do also have checks from the other branches, which we'll get to later. But or it could be the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or all sorts of these agencies who make these rules. They may come down on a company and say, hey, you made this product that violated safety regulations, and might be issued fines, and they could bring that to the agency and dispute it, and they basically hire judges, people who act as judges, to work in a lot of these agencies to handle those complaints. So on the next few slides, we're going to look at the different parts of the bureaucracy, and some of the agencies that make up the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I want to add that this cartoon underscores one of the things that Mr. Phillips mentioned before. As you can see, that one of the drawbacks of the bureaucracy being such a large entity is that it's easier then to displace blame. What do I mean by that? It's easier to finger point when something goes wrong, because you're such a large entity. You can simply, if you will, pass the buck or the blame onto someone else, or the responsibility onto someone else. Mr. Phillips was telling you of some of his experiences with bureaucracy, and I can tell you, of course, I'm going to tell you one I was having to fix a mistake, really, on behalf of the county I live in terms of my voter registration. I had filled out everything properly, but there was some discrepancy between where I was voting and my voter card and the voter information, and I ended up having to spend a good 3 hours almost in this this department, or if you will, this building that houses the departments for the county. And I would go to one of their windows, or one of the agencies within this county's government, and they would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, you have to go to this other place, this other office." I would go to that other office. They would hand me a form, and then they say, "Okay, you need to go upstairs to this other office to fill out this form." And I really felt like this was extraordinarily illustrative of the frustration people go through with bureaucracies, is that, it's so easy to sort of say, well, I'm sorry, no, you have to go here, or we don't do that. You go to this office, or you go to this window, and it really is like that. And so, again, of course, yes, they have procedures they have to follow, but it is very inefficient at times, given that you have to, if you will, go to all these different places. And you can imagine, myself being a rather well-informed individual, navigating this process was doable, and I ultimately resolved the issue, and it was a fault on the county's behalf, not mine. But you could imagine someone who may not be as resourceful, or who may not have as much time, frankly, to sort out the problems of the bureaucracy in getting the right voting information, and they may just decide not to vote at all. And so this is really consequential. In other words, there are high stakes involved here, and it's worth understanding how this entity works and where the flaws are, and hopefully also advocating for some changes to make it work more efficiently.
So we're going to look at the bureaucracy in terms of these different categories. I think, did you want to say something about the ways to remember with the thickness of the lines? Or
Right. So the bureaucracy, we know at the helm of the bureaucracy is the president. And so graphics are really helpful, right? Because they give us graphic representation of knowledge or information. And here you can see various types of information being conveyed through this one graphic. One, you get a sense for the hierarchical nature, perhaps, of the bureaucracy. But you'll notice as well there are arrows, right, indicating the kind of relationship the president has with each entity within the bureaucracy, right? And You'll notice that we'll start from left to right, and over here with the EOP, the Executive Office of the President, which includes the White House staff, you'll notice that this arrow is the thickest of all of the arrows, and that suggests that the president has the most control and the tightest, if you will, or the most expansive relationship with this group of people. And essentially, this group of people are there to help the president carry out his responsibilities, and they are working directly with the president in order to do that. Now, all of these entities are helping the president in some form or fashion, but some of them are helping the president directly in carrying out these functions, while others are more independent in how they are helping the president carry out his or her responsibilities. So, heading back to the EOP, which includes the White House staff. The White House staff, those people are the persons oftentimes closest to the president, who have close personal relationships with the president, who are on his campaign. We'll go into that more so later. But I think what I want to just have you take away from this is pay attention to the graphics, because they can really help you, encapsulate a lot of information in a very simplified way. But I want to give you this last point about the EOP. The president can hire and fire the people in the EOP for the most part at will. In other words, whomever works in the EOP, and especially the White House staff, really serves at the will of the president. So he has a lot of the power to either to both hire and fire those people. Now, if you go down below here with the executive branch departments, aka the cabinet, you'll see that the line is still, if you will, solid, but it's much more narrow, right? It's narrower, if you will, than the line between the president and the EOP. And the reason is because the president can nominate someone to be a cabinet secretary, but must get Senate approval before that secretary is indeed confirmed or being able to assume their position. So because the president would still need approval, you'll see that their ability to directly control this branch, or this, if you will, this part of the bureaucracy is a little more limited. However, the president can fire these people at will. He can ask them to resign whenever he wants to. And we've seen a lot of that, actually, with this most recent president. A lot of the members have either been asked to resign or have resigned. And so that's been rather instructive in terms of figuring out what the relationship is between the president and the cabinet. And then finally, as we move here to the right, we see the independent agencies, boards, and commissions. And you'll notice that this line is not solid, it's broken. And you could probably guess why. Because the president, while they get to appoint the people who are going into these independent agencies, boards, and commissions, they need Senate approval, and they can't just fire them if they want. So they need to have what's called good cause, or proof of malfeasance, or some wrongdoing. In other words, the president can't just willy-nilly decide to fire these individuals. Now, in the past, of course, there have been attempts by presidents to fire these individuals, and they have been brought to court. And sometimes the president prevails, sometimes they don't. But it is worth noting that the independent agencies, boards, and commissions, while they work for the president, they do not receive instruction from the president. They can give the president updates and reports, but they are not taking their marching orders from the president. Whereas with the EOP and the executive branch departments, they do take their marching orders from the president.
Another bureaucracy joke real quick. So the phrase you might see hanging above a bureaucrat's desk, well, they say hard work never killed anyone, but why take the chance? Anyway, so this is the first category, and the executive departments. These date back again all the way to George Washington. You had the first four departments were the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, it was called the Department of War, now Defense, and the Office of the Attorney General, which later became the Department of Justice. But since then, Congress has created, 11 additional departments. So we have 15 total cabinet departments. The newest was Homeland Security, which was created not too long after the 9/11 attacks. So these departments are, they head up many of the functions of the government. We said most of the workers in the federal government work for one of these 15 cabinet departments. And so each, except for the Justice Department, is headed by someone with the title Secretary. So these people are appointed by the president and have to be confirmed by the Senate. But remember, all these departments and all of these government agencies, none of them are in the Constitution, right? And so all of these were created by acts of Congress. And so when Congress creates them, they also lay out the purpose of each of these departments and their mission. And remember, Congress constantly then also oversees these departments, the oversight function. And so, of course, that leads to that tension that we continue to talk about throughout the semester. But anyway, so these departments basically run the government. They're the ones who run the agencies, run the departments of the government that most people would deal with as citizens. And so you'd have, for instance, Department of State is more our foreign policy, like trying to keep peace with other countries, staffing our foreign embassies. Department of Defense, which heads our military branches. So all of these different departments have different functions. Of course, Department of Education that sets national education policy and handles student loan programs. So I mean, just so many things that the government does. But these departments, on one hand, the cabinet secretaries are advisors to the president. So he occasionally will hold a cabinet meeting in which they'll meet and discuss issues, and then maybe he'll ask for reports or for them to give advice. But these people are also heads of their agencies. So if the president is like the CEO of the executive branch, these cabinet secretaries are like the vice presidents or presidents of the different departments within a large
CEOs.
Corporation, right? So they report to the president, but to a large extent they're independent because the president sort of gives them the authority to oversee their own department. And anyway, so he does pick them. He can fire them for basically any reason he sees fit. But again, they do need Senate approval, and they are going to give the president hopefully honest opinions and advice, but they're also going to be looking out for the good of their departments. And so in a sense, they have a little bit more of we might say, a split loyalty compared to some of the other advisors we're going to talk about later. Because on one hand, they serve the president, but they also, you can imagine, like if the president was saying, hey, we really need to make some budget cuts, who here, in a cabinet meeting, who's going to step up and volunteer to cut their agency and the funding? You're probably not going to see a lot of hands go up.
Nowadays.
Okay, depends on if you believe in the mission of your agency, but that's true because each president the departments can take on different character depending on who's in charge of it. Because, for instance, a funny story about Rick Perry is the former governor of Texas. And when he ran for president several years ago, he at first in a Republican debate, he was talking about which cabinet departments in his platform, in his his positions, he had said he wanted to eliminate 3 cabinet departments, and he couldn't remember. He eventually said, I think it was the Department of Education and maybe the Department of Commerce or something, and then he couldn't think of the third one. And he said, what is that third one? And he's in the middle of this debate on live television, and he can't remember like a focal point of his platform. Well, the ironic thing is the department he could not think of that he thought was useless, right, and should be eliminated was the Department of Energy. Well, guess what he's the secretary of now? He is the secretary of the Department of Energy, the department he said should be abolished because it's worthless. So it's just these types of things happen. Sometimes people end up heading agencies in the government that they don't really believe in.
Again, I want to just stress what Mr. Phillipps says. Don't forget that notion of the split loyalties. That will be something that we will emphasize and will want you to understand the idea that while these while these secretaries have allegiance to the president, they also have allegiance to their departments.
Okay, so I think I've already mentioned a lot of this. So it's just so that again, these departments are not mentioned in the Constitution. They're created by Congress. They have to be passed by the House and Senate and to be created. And they set the parameters of what these departments are supposed to do. So they can also add or delete these agencies if they see fit. So the president has direct control over the heads of these departments, but he really doesn't have much control over the lower level workers in these departments because remember, they're professionals and permanent employees.
So sorry.
Oh, who's getting a little
all right? There we
trigger
go.
happy now?
Yeah.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah. So anyway, you can see from this graphic that the original members of the Trump cabinet or advisor roles, many of them have either had to resign, have been fired. In the case of Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who has the question mark over his face, there's been a lot of chatter about Trump wanting to fire him, perhaps after the midterm elections. So we can see that, there's definitely always turnover in cabinets, but there's been a lot more turnover here sooner than usual in this particular White House. For better or worse, who knows? But nonetheless, there's this graphic so you can get a sense for who's still around. All right. So the executive office of the president is, again, a little misleading in terms of the title because we want to really stress this, that the EOP is not a single office or department, but a collection of agencies that help the president or that are directly responsible for helping the president manage the executive branch. Remember, these persons are going to be the persons that the president works most closely with, especially since the EOP includes the White House staff. The White House staff, I often tell students, just think about it. The White House, aside from being a place of work, is also the actual home of the president, right? And you're not likely to invite people into your home who you don't trust or have confidence in. So the White House staff are typically people the president knows or trusts and who are working in very close contact with the president. So these are individuals that the president has a lot of control over and are also probably closest to the president. Oftentimes the members of the White House staff, for example, are individuals who had worked on the president's campaign to get elected. And so they've had a long-standing rapport or relationship with the president already. So you can see here the EOP, again, consists of agencies and individuals who directly assist the president in completion of his duties. And these examples that we've provided to you are really illustrative of the most important, if you will, or some of the most important agencies within the EOP. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, as you can imagine, the ability to craft and develop a budget. And remember, we had talked about in prior slides how the president has now taken a leading role in developing the budget of the country, in large part because Congress has been quite inept and also deferential as a result of its incompetence to the president in terms of formulating a budget. So the Office of Management and Budget has a tremendous amount of power because they're essentially deciding generally what's being spent on what and how much money's coming in from where. You can see as well the National Security Council, for obvious reasons, is very influential. National security is always paramount. And of course the Council of Economic Advisors. In this case, right, the health of the economy can determine a lot about what is going on, or rather what the electoral prospects are of the president, for sure, but also the health of the nation. It can go hand in hand with the health of the economy. And finally, the White House office, right, the personal staff of the president.
So the National Security Council, for example, is headed by the National Security Advisor. The president can pick whoever he wants for that position without Senate approval. And so, it allows him more flexibility to pick someone he trusts, but also someone who maybe more controversial in some ways, or he's friends with him, but maybe the Senate wouldn't think as much of that person or whatever. But now the National Security Council would also consist of maybe some of the top cabinet officials like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, most likely the President's Chief of Staff, the Vice President, heads of the military branches, and so there he would convene the National Security Council if he had a question about national security, but also like foreign, like should we send troops into this country, or how should we respond to this threat from Iran, and things like that. So they meet about really important issues, and it makes sense that he would want to meet with these people to discuss national security issues rather than, for example, his cabinet. Because again, honestly, do you really need input from like the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development or the Secretary of Education, to figure out what to do about how are we going to get Osama bin Laden or something? So like this, these groups tend to have more specialized functions in terms of directly advising the president and helping him do his job. So again, just more about the specific agencies. This one, the White House staff, which we've already mentioned. These are people, as you might imagine, work in the White House. So the EOP, the executive offices, mostly are located close to the White House, but these people live in, I'm not sorry, that work in the White House, practically live there because many of them are there from dawn till dusk. But
Sort of like us.
yeah, exactly, like us at school. And so anyway, so again, these are it's worth noting that these people can be handpicked by the president because they don't need approval from the Senate. And although again, President Trump's not the typical president because he did not have, well, for many reasons, but one is he didn't have he didn't have these people that from his past because he wasn't involved in politics. He's the first president to have neither political nor military experience, so he really didn't have people who knew much about the government to bring in. Because you looked at, say, George Bush, he brought a lot of people in from Texas when he was governor, and then a lot of those people then directly went from his staff as governor to his staff as president. Jimmy Carter brought a lot of people in from Georgia and so forth. So it's people you really trust, people who are going to be very loyal to you, and that their whole purpose is to serve you and to be loyal and to try to make your presidency more successful. Again, we've seen this, with President Trump bringing in people. The chief of staff is often considered the second most powerful person in Washington, and that has not necessarily been the case with President Trump, because in his case, probably his most trusted advisors are like people in his family. But again, that is not the norm. The norm is that you bring in these people who you've worked with for many years, and people you trust, but also people who have expertise, who've worked in the government and understand how government works. And in many cases, if you want to talk to the president, you see it's often called the gatekeeper, the chief of staff, because in the past, most people, if you want to talk to the president, you first have to go to the chief of staff and run it by him and see if it's important enough for the president to hear about it. So, John Kelly is the current chief of staff. He's apparently tried to implement more discipline in the White House, but if you believe, some of the stories that come out of the White House, it's more of a crazy, kind of a crazy atmosphere.
So you can see here, as we've already mentioned, the EOP, or if you will, the members in the EOP report directly to the president. I already mentioned the Office of Management and Budget being a really important agency, so you'll want to take note of that, as well as the National Security Council and the Council of Economic Advisors. And then again, don't forget the EOP agency heads are hired and fired at the will of the president. And Congress is really not involved with the approval of persons like the National Security Advisor or the president's personal White House staff. So the president has an extraordinary amount of control over this particular entity. So in addition to the cabinet and of course the EOP, there are the independent agencies, boards, and commissions. Now these are not part of the cabinet nor part of the EOP, clearly. They are different types of agencies, and I mentioned already how the members here are appointed by the president, need approval from the Senate, but they also can't be fired, or I should just say they can't be fired at will. There has to be good cause. So this, of course, is put in place in order to make certain that these commissions and agencies can remain independent, right? Obviously, this would be a key feature of helping these agencies, boards, and commissions be independent. And once again, I want to stress that these agencies, boards, and commissions, they do not take their marching orders from the president. So they do report to the president in that they give reports and updates to the president, but they do not take their marching orders from the president because they are to remain independent. So you can see here that within this entity, if you will, part of the executive branch, we have independent regulatory agencies and commissions. And these agencies and commissions, they typically police some part of the economy. They police businesses, corporations, or the government themselves. They make sure companies and corporations are following the laws, and they act as sort of like the watchdog of the executive branch. They play a very important role to make certain that abuses or excesses are kept in check or reined in. We'll discuss some examples here momentarily.
Okay, so here's some examples. I'd say a lot of these independent agencies, or the more independent they are, oftentimes one sign of that is if it ends in commission. So notice how these commissions are not headed by one person. So even though you even have like independent agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency, which is headed by one director, but in this case it's a commission of people. So not just one person is making the decisions, which again gives them more independence and allows them to make decisions more fairly and in a more balanced way. Also, notice how they often serve longer fixed terms, and they are run by a board, so therefore they also stagger those terms. So all these things were done by Congress to try to give them more independence. For instance, you might have a board of, say, 10 members or 5 members or something, and the president would appoint, maybe a vacancy would come open where President Trump would get to appoint a new person, but maybe some of those other people have been there from the Obama presidency and were appointed by President Obama. Now they do need Senate confirmation, so the president can't get too partisan in terms of who he picks, perhaps. So if you had divided government. So anyway, the point is, we want these commissions to be independent. We don't want them to be overly partisan or overly political. Think about like the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're in charge of regulating the stock market. You wouldn't want the president trying to pressure them if they're investigating someone for stock fraud or a corporation for overvaluing their stocks or something like that, insider trading. That you wouldn't want the president to jump in and say, hey, that guy was a big donor to my campaign, or that corporation, their PAC gave me money or gives a lot of money to the Republicans, so you need to back off that investigation. Let's focus on investigating Democrats. And you don't want to weaponize these agencies, or these you want them to be independent, and you want them to do their job, which is to regulate, to make sure businesses aren't abusing their power. Or you look at the Consumer Product Safety Commission to make sure we want safe products. So we don't want these commissions to be biased and only going after certain companies that they don't like. Or you look at the Federal Election Commission. We don't want them, only going after one party or the other for election violations. And so there's a reason these commissions exist, and that's to hopefully keep society honest, keep people honest, the corporations or politicians themselves, and that's why they need this independence.
Here's another example, the Federal Communications Commission. As Mr. Phillips already mentioned, we want these commissions and boards and agencies to be in fact independent so that they can make sure that our government is working in a way that's just and fair and functional, frankly, as well. And you can see here that the FCC, as you can see by the name Communications Commission, regulates what's on television and other media outlets. They typically are going to be the ones who also fine, like they could fine Fox or ABC or NBC or CBS if, for example, they're found in violation of some rules or regulations, such as profanity. If, for example, one of these news outlets or these media conglomerates, Fox News, Fox, if you will, or MSNBC or CBS, and so on, or NBC, if they allow for someone on their program to use a profane word and they don't adequately bleep it or censor it, then they can be fined, and the FCC is going to be the one who determines if you get fined for a violation of one of their rules or regulations. Now, we're going to talk more in detail when we get to media about the FCC, so I don't want to spend an extraordinary amount of time going over every example, or rather detail with respect to the FCC, because we will revisit this particular commission. As Mr. Phillips already mentioned, we looked here at the Securities Exchange Commission, that they regulate the stock market. I'm flipping back to this slide for a moment because I want to mention one other thing that's true about commissions. Mr. Phillips already mentioned that there are limitations oftentimes as to how presidents are able to fill these boards. Remember, we talked about staggered election or appointments. In other words, that you can't appoint everybody to fill the positions on a board all at once, that their seats only come up every so many years, and only a couple of them or one of them. Also, that that you can't fire them at will. Another limitation to the appointment of members to these boards is that sometimes, like in the case of the Federal Elections Commission, you have to appoint people from the other party. And that is to indeed ensure that there is fairness and lack of bias when it comes to the oversight of elections. As you can imagine, in this case, I believe it's a 5 board. If you'll look that up for me real quick, I think there's 5 members on the FEC, and at least 2 of them have to be from the other party. Again, to make certain that there isn't a, if you will, abuse of power and a subversion of the electoral process. So again, this is yet another limitation on who the president can appoint when it comes to these independent agencies and commissions. So there are 6 members and
6-year term.
And there are 6-year terms. And do we have how
every
many?
2 years, 2 seats rotate.
Every 2 seats will come up for every 2 years. So that's the staggering. What's that?
So no more than 3 can be from the same party.
And no more than 3 members can be from the same party. So you can see here again that this is yet another limitation to who the president can appoint.
And they also rotate the head chairmanship.
Yeah. NASA is an interesting situation where it really doesn't fit under any real category. That's why it's in this other independent agencies and commissions, because it's not a cabinet department, it's not part of the EOP, and it really is not an independent, it's not regulating anything. What happened was that in the 1950s, the United States became quite concerned when Russia was able to launch Sputnik, a satellite, into space, and this sort of really startled and shook a lot of people in the United States, in that their confidence in that they were on top of everything. And of course, there was the Red Scares. They were concerned about the spread of communism, and there was this competition between the USSR, which was representing communism, and the US, which was representing democracy, at least ostensibly. And then obviously this was really crippling, to the confidence of the United States, and so they realized that they were going to have to really, jumpstart their efforts in science and math and technology. So they started to put a lot more emphasis in education on these areas, and indeed created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and of course made great strides in getting a man on the moon and other sort of missions as well. But this is just to underscore the idea here that the government may involve itself in areas that are of national importance that we may not have been able to foresee prior to some technological development or historical event.
Okay, now that we've gotten a history of space travel from Mr. Davila. So another category is government corporations. So just as it sounds, it's a combination of sort of corporate entities that are subsidized by the government. So they sort of function like corporations. They charge for their services, and or in most of these cases, they charge for their services. They provide a service, but in some cases, it's maybe companies that wouldn't be able to survive without some help from the government, and so the government sees them as having a helpful purpose or a necessary purpose. So here you see Amtrak, which is a train service, and Amtrak has had trouble. I think it started as a private company, and then the government sort of stepped in when they were about to fail, because a lot of people, especially in the Northeast, rely on train service to get around, to get to work and things like that. And so, I think they were having trouble with their profits. So the government steps in and subsidizes it, because, many people use that to get to work. And without it, that would hurt our economy if these people weren't able to get to work on time, or to have to wait in tons, long, lots of traffic and things like that. You also have, of course, the Postal Service, which, of course, has competition from other delivery agency or delivery department services. But again, the problem with the Postal Service is not, if we got rid of the Postal Service, we'd be fine. Like in Atlanta, there'd be, you could have UPS or FedEx. But I mean, what about rural areas? What does UPS and FedEx, do they want to deliver mail out to, in the middle of Montana somewhere where nobody lives hardly? But like the Postal Service will deliver to many of these, to these places, these remote areas. And so those people also need to receive, their mail and so forth. So PBS, which benefits, has a lot of educational programming. But you also have one that's not on here. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a good example of which was created during the Great Depression, and they provided, energy to a lot of this area, the Tennessee Valley, which is a very poverty-stricken area. And it wouldn't really be profitable for private companies to go in there and put up all the power lines and provide electricity to these areas, and so these people would be without power. So the government stepped in and created the Tennessee Valley Authority to provide energy. So the government is subsidizing these companies, but they're providing a valuable service.
So some criticisms and challenges of the federal bureaucracy. We already understand that its large size is going to make it unwieldy in certain areas, in certain ways. We already understand that certain aspects of it being so focused on rule and regulation is going to make it inflexible. And of course that, if there's misalignment with the, who's appointed at the helm of a department or agency, there you can see there will be issues with carrying out the functions of that particular agency. But we're going to go into a little bit more detail as to some specifics about some criticisms and challenges of the federal bureaucracy. The first here is red tape, which we already discussed at the beginning. And again, red tape is referring to the excessive rules and regulations that people have to go through in order to get whatever service or benefit they're looking for. Again, the people who are proponents of or if you will, the flip side of this viewpoint would be that, well, having, uniform procedures is a good thing to make sure that there is no bias in how services are meted out and to make sure that everybody is treated, fairly and equally. But again, people can get very frustrated with the amount of paperwork they have to fill or the amount of things they have to go through in order to get the service or benefit. So, and ultimately it can discourage people from getting the benefit at all, which is quite bad in that it sort of undermines the ultimate responsibility of the government, which is to make sure that it's providing the services and benefits to its people. So another question is, of course, that when the federal bureaucracy gets one of these laws, they have flexibility to make rules and regulations based on their discretion, right? Discretionary authority. And to some extent, this is a good thing because it allows the experts or the people with expertise in the area to make the sort of detailed rules and regulations in order to make sure that the spirit of the law is indeed does come to life and is made operational. But you can see, though, that when you allow for too much flexibility, or when you allow for this flexibility, there's the possibility that the president can issue an executive order, right, or have the departments and or agencies interpret the law in a way that maybe Congress did not intend, but may be more consistent with what the president wants. So, again, that lack of clarity could lead to incorrect interpretations. In other words, interpretations that are not consistent with what Congress had originally intended. And again, they have been manipulated in a way that fits the president's agenda, but may not indeed embody the spirit of the law. Yet another criticism is that there are not sufficient resources for agencies to do what they're tasked with doing. I think one of them that comes to mind is the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Of course, they are not a huge, there's not a huge following of people who really like the IRS for obvious reasons, right? Because you are going to be asked to pay your taxes. But you got to remember that those taxes indeed fund a lot of the services that you or others depend on, right? I mean, medical benefits and the like. So when you defund or under-resource the IRS, that also then means that revenue the government would be getting, if there's less revenue, then there are not going to be enough, there won't be sufficient funds to cover all the services or benefits that people want. So there's always this sort of, interesting disconnect between what people are willing to pay and what they expect, right? And so oftentimes, there people would like something for free, but that's just not how things work. And they understand that in order to get a benefit or service, the money has to come from somewhere. So when you cut the budgets or staff of any of these agencies, you are going to compromise their ability to carry out some essential function of the government. I mean, another one that comes to mind is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Those persons are responsible for making sure that our food is safe. And I think it's not coincidence that when we saw the defunding of the FDA, that we started to see an increase in the number of outbreaks of listeria and, salmonella and other areas where if they're not tightly regulated in terms of, food and, if you will, the quality or safety of the food, then we run the risk that we're going to have food on these grocery shelves that is unsafe. So now there may be reasons, right, to cut the budgets in other areas where, if you will, there may be inefficiencies. But remember, there's a very, very important cost-benefit analysis that should be done. Even despite the popularity of an agency or department, they may be carrying out a very essential function that is connected to something that you do like or want.
All right, so former President Ronald Reagan he was good at one-liners, and one of his funny ones, I guess, was he said the most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And so, but so we joke it's easy to make fun of the government and the bureaucracy and so forth, but like Mr. Davila said, they do provide a lot of important functions, and I think we've learned from history that if you leave any individuals or corporations, if you leave them to their own devices and just hope that they do the right thing, you will often be severely disappointed.
Right, we played the state of nature game precisely for this reason at the beginning of the year, so that you clearly had hard evidence that when this idea that sort of, left to our own devices, we'll just figure it out, yeah, that didn't quite work out that way.
Okay, so another problem with the bureaucracy is just that, with so many agencies, oftentimes their functions are overlapping and their jobs, they cross over with each other's functions. And you have maybe, for instance, let's say, who enforces drug enforcement in this country? Is it you have FBI plays a role, and so does the Drug Enforcement Agency, and so does the Bureau of Tobacco, Alcohol, Firearms, and Explosives, and so you could have these overlapping agencies, and so sometimes that causes confusion or lack of efficiency, and so also that you're trying to combat diseases. You have the Department of Health and Human Services, and but you also have
CDC.
Yeah, the CDC and different agencies within that. So anyway, so that's one of the problems with the bureaucracy as well.
One of the other things I want to mention here is that the creation of Homeland Security was due precisely to the lack of communication between the agencies. Once 9/11 happened, there was a commission that was tasked with figuring out what went wrong. And there was a special committee as well in Congress that was tasked with finding out what went wrong. And one of the things they figured out was that the various agencies and departments were not talking to each other. In other words, the CIA had information that the FBI didn't, that other agencies didn't, but none of them were communicating with each other. So they all had pieces of the puzzle, but none of them were sharing the puzzle pieces so that they could create the larger narrative. And as a result, we got, a very tragic event that ensued. And so the Department of Homeland Security was created precisely to address this criticism, the lack of communication between the agencies.
So here's another scenario that we've included to help you understand, the fact that many agencies have overlapping functions. So here's our example. So President Trump, of course, one of his big campaign slogans was to build the wall, right? And so, it kind of ignores the fact that we already have largely a wall in place between the United States and Mexico, but that's a story for another day. But here's the fun. So first off, Congress, let's just say that they passed the funding for Trump's border wall, but who actually builds it and how does it actually take effect? So first off, the Army Corps of Engineers, maybe they would be in charge of the actual physical construction or coming up with prototypes.
The site planning, right? The look of the wall, the sort of feasibility of the wall as well in terms of the logistics. What's involved with the lands, the terrain, and so on.
Yeah. So you also and of course keep in mind also you're saying as you build the wall, other things are going to come into play, and so we're trying to increase border security, but on the other hand, you're going to have other issues. So you have the Department of Homeland Security, which the Border Patrol is part of, and so you'd have the Border Patrol and agencies like that, and ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, I believe, and so you have different agencies within Homeland Security that would play a role in the actual manning of the wall. Now you have also immigration naturalization services, so they have to deal with immigrants who do come through and maybe they're claiming refugee status, or they may have need medical care, or need where do you hold them if they're being detained because they tried to cross illegally and things like that. So INS would get involved. And then what if sometimes people are trying to bring drugs across the border? So if you apprehend a group of drug runners, and the DEA would get involved. With the Border Patrol might make the arrest, but then they turn them over to the DEA for processing and investigation. And then the FBI might get involved as well. The FBI, what if someone's crossing and they suspect them of being a terrorist suspect or some other, if they've committed other crimes in the past.
Trafficking.
Yeah, or trafficking humans and things. And so you have maybe the FBI would be, some of the people crossing might be turned over to the FBI. And then again, you have the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which again would deal with people who have maybe legitimate claims. They're seeking asylum in the United States. And, we've had a lot of issues with this recently with, it is legal to come to the United States and claim asylum, ask for refugee status and say, your country is dangerous or your life is at risk. And, so they'd have to deal with those issues, those legal issues as well.
So you can see here that all of these agencies and departments would also be necessary in terms of getting input or providing input with the creation of this wall, because logistically they're all implicated in some way. So in addition to the actual manning of the wall, maintenance of the wall, but prior to even the further creation of the wall, these departments and agencies would all have to have input or would want to have input, and they may have competing interests, right? I mean, the Immigration and Naturalization Services or the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration may have very different concerns than the Drug Enforcement Administration or the FBI. So these competing interests are going to complicate matters as well. So does the bureaucracy undermine democracy, right? If you remember that the bureaucrats are indeed unelected officials, right? They are experts, but they're not elected. They are career individuals who have chosen to work in the federal government, as a career choice. But they are not subject to the accountability that comes along with elections. So is the question that arises is that is too much power given to unelected policymakers, given the broad and sweeping powers that in some cases the bureaucrats are able to wield. And this is a criticism that crops up all the time when we see a department or agency gain, say, even broader or more flexibility in executing their particular duties or responsibilities. If you recall before, I mentioned that there was if you will, a precipitating moment, a tipping point when it finally occurred to Congress that we had reached a low enough point that things needed to change. And there was so much corruption, there was so much graft, there was so much, if you will, patronage going on when prior to, I think it was 1896 or 97 when Pendleton, can you check that?
I think it's 83.
1883, that we finally had Congress decide that it was time to pass a Civil Service Act or the Pendleton Act. But what was happening before this act was hiring was based on political favors, quid pro quo. Essentially, it would go like this. A lot of the cities, the big cities or population centers throughout the United States and the rural areas, they were dominated by one or the other party. And the party would typically have what was called a political machine. Essentially, a series, a boss, if you will, at the helm of this machine, but that would work to elect members of that party always, to office and to win elections. And the basic exchange was these bosses or these individuals who wanted in the party who wanted to win all the time would promise that if an individual, for example, guaranteed that they themselves would vote for them as well as bring maybe 100 of their friends to vote for them as well, then they would give them a position in their new administration. And so that's why it's called the spoils system, because in turn for their loyalty or in turn for their votes, if your person won, they would then give you a position or would have the power to give you a position in their administration. But of course, this had the glaring problem of putting people in positions of power that had no expertise or competency in what they were overseeing. And you can imagine the problems that would arise as a result of having, very ill-informed or completely unaware individuals in positions that were consequential, right? I mean, this was going to be disastrous.
And so you'd also see, the idea of to the victor belong the spoils. Usually that would refer to like winning a battle in a war. But in this case, it could be winning the presidency. So a new party comes in, especially when there was a change of party control. If a new president was elected from a different party, he would largely clean house throughout the government and then replace them with his own cronies, his own supporters. And, of course, again, not only would they not have expertise, but they wouldn't even have experience. And so, again, this was corrected largely by the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883, and it changes, the bureaucracy in large part, cuts down on the president's ability to distribute patronage. Now there are still positions that can be distributed to party loyalists, sometimes ambassador positions or memberships on certain lesser boards and commissions that aren't as high profile, but
or scrutinized.
Yeah. Right. So in this case, though, the main thing you need to know is that we go again from, instead of patronage or handing out jobs based on loyalty and favors, now we introduce a merit-based system of hiring, and so people get jobs with the government based on their qualifications, and oftentimes it also requires passage of the civil service exam. So you'd have to apply for the job and have your resume and do interviews and pass the civil service exam, and so we're trying to make sure we eliminate people who are not qualified. Okay, so now we're going to look at how the other branches of government can control the bureaucracy. All this is important, but I would say, as far as the new format of the AP exam, this is probably the type of stuff you're going to really see in terms of questions, FRQs, and so forth, and multiple choice questions. They really want to get it more into like how the different branches interact and control each other. So let's make sure you haven't fallen asleep yet. Wake yourself up, drink, get some more caffeine. So here we go. So
hold on. So the president. So one way the executive, of course, oversees or controls the bureaucracy is that they have the ability to appoint the individuals who head these departments and agencies. In fact, the top 2 or so positions the president is able to appoint, and therefore those individuals can indeed hire and fire and oversee the administration of these departments. And so to the extent that these individuals are carrying out the vision and the priorities of the president, or indeed if the president decides that there's a certain initiative he wants to see or general vision he wants to see implemented, these members that he appoints at the helm or at the head of these departments and agencies would in theory carry that vision out, or if you will, constrain the department so as to make sure it's conforming to what the president wants to see happen. In addition, the president can adjust the budget requests of these departments and agencies, and this, of course, can be used as a stick, a punishment, indeed, or a reward in the event that it's something the particular department or agency is carrying out that the president likes or wants. In addition, the president can reorganize an agency. Remember that these agencies and departments largely serve to help the president carry out their responsibilities. So the president's given broad flexibility to sort of manipulate, conform, and tinker with these various departments and agencies such that they fulfill the mission of helping him or her carry out their responsibilities. And then finally, they can be very direct in how they want the agency or department to carry out something specifically in issuing executive orders. Remember, an executive order is an order or directive from the president to the bureaucracy as to how the president wants them to carry out or implement a certain law, which has a huge impact, because ultimately that's what really matters most, is how the law is carried out, not how it was originally passed, but whether or not it's being carried out in one or another way.
And remember that the presidents that come into power, the new president, can overturn any executive orders that were put in place by the previous president. So, of course, a lot of Obama's regulations have been overturned or rewritten by the Trump administration. For example, Obama had many executive orders to clamp down on the coal industry and fossil fuels and try to, cut back on our use of coal. And a lot of those orders have been reversed. And in fact, policies have been put in place to encourage more coal production. So Congress also plays an important role in checking the bureaucracy. Remember that they make these agencies, they create them. And that means they could also get rid of them. I don't think that's listed here, but technically that would be true. Now, of course, the Senate has to approve presidential appointees. So when he appoints the heads of these agencies, the cabinet secretaries, or head of the EPA, or head of a lot, if he appoints new members of the commissions and boards, they almost all of these would be subject to Senate approval, the heads of the agencies. So they can also, again, tinker with the department budget. So if you had a Republican Congress, Republican president, you're probably going to see increased funding for certain departments, but maybe cuts in others. And again, they can use this sort of as a carrot or stick as well. So where their priorities lie. We talked about oversight, again, very important to understand. Congress can hold hearings to hold these agencies accountable, call the heads of the agencies or different administrators and ask them questions and grill them if they think something's not going right, like we saw when we watched the hearings where they called in people from the Veterans Administration who they thought were failing to provide adequate health care to veterans. And so they can hold hearings to keep these agencies honest and check up on them. You also have, they could tinker with the legislation itself. They could rewrite legislation to clarify if they think the administration is misinterpreting the law, or they could repeal the law, things like that. You also have the infamous legislative veto, which yes. We love so much. But anyway, so I don't think it's used very often, but Congress can overturn an agency order. So like when the agencies issue a new rule, if Congress doesn't like it, they could pass a resolution to overturn that agency's regulation that was put in place. So if they, if let's say there was a Democratic president and the EPA passed a stricter environmental regulation, maybe a Republican Congress could just vote to repeal that regulation.
Just remember with the legislative veto that while if both houses, both the Senate and the House agree, it can effectively be put into effect, rather override a particular rule or regulation. But if only one house does, that's not sufficient. So one house cannot issue a legislative veto. It has to be both houses, both chambers. So, of course, the courts can step in. If you recall, I mentioned this when we talked about the bureaucrats' ability, or the bureaucratic agencies and departments' ability to adjudicate matters that come before them, especially the independent regulatory agencies. And indeed, if one party does not like the outcome of the bureaucratic decision or bureaucratic judgment, then they can challenge that and sue them in federal court. And so courts can effectively overturn rulings made by the administrative agencies if they're appealed. Of course, they'd be exercising their ability to oversee here any action or rule of law and deem it unconstitutional if indeed it runs afoul of something in the Constitution, or if it indeed is inconsistent with some federal statute. So, now we turn our attention to an interesting dynamic called the iron triangle. In this case, we're going to look at the, if you will, collusion between lobbyists and the interest groups. Indeed, the interest groups hire lobbyists to carry out certain persuasive functions and their ability to get favorable legislation passed. But nonetheless, the collusion, if you will, between interest groups, the legislative branch, and ultimately the bureaucracy. The general idea is the following, that interest groups have been very effective in getting legislation as well as rules and regulations that are favorable to them. And the question is, well, how have they been able to do that? Well, ultimately what happens is that you're going to have an interest group, and they often have money or influential people who are working for them. Those influential people are called lobbyists, and they're going to have meetings, negotiations, and talks with members in the legislative branch. Oftentimes, these lobbyists are going to say, hey, if you pass this law, I can guarantee you that our interest group is going to give you a lot of money for your next campaign. And money talks. And so a lot of these members in the legislature, they agree to pass a law that's favorable to that interest group. But as we've already found out, that that just passing a law won't in fact guarantee that's how it's going to sort of manifest itself in reality. In other words, the law is just a broad general statement of principle. So you also then need the bureaucracy on board. So oftentimes, once the legislative branch has been bought in some one or another fashion, or is on board with this persuasive lobbying by the interest group, the passage of the law happens, and then the bureaucrats are needed in order to make sure that it's implemented in a way that also favors the interest group. So the legislative branch oftentimes says to the bureaucracy, look, we need you to make sure you are, going to implement this law in a way that's favorable. And, one way they can apply pressure on the bureaucracy is, of course, the legislative branch controls the budget, right? They control the money, the purse strings. And so they can threaten a bureaucratic department or agency if they don't, if you will, play along with cutting funds to their budget. Or if on the flip side, if the bureaucratic agency does play along, they will promise to increase funding to that particular agency in turn for assurances that there would be, favorable kind of rules and regulations for this particular interest group. And ultimately then the bureaucrats would pass some favorable rule or regulation that benefits the particular interest group. And there you see the collusion that exists in the iron triangle is now complete. Now, of course, there's an exchange. I'm going to let Mr. Phillipps chime in here as to what the other entities may get in return. But you have the general idea here. The interest group promised money to the legislature to make sure to pass a favorable law. The legislature passes the favorable law and makes sure to increase the budget to the bureaucrats who pass rules and regulations that benefit that interest group ultimately and their industry most likely.
Okay, so we're going to give you a specific example. So another thing to mention here is, you guys probably learn about this in science. It's a symbiotic relationship. In other words, it's mutually beneficial, and these are all these agencies are all the three parts of the triangle are dependent on one another. You see the arrows go in both directions. That means the benefits go in both directions. So let's say we're talking about laws on tobacco, right? Like cigarettes or something, or tobacco that people chew in tobacco or whatever, right? And so you have in the case of tobacco legislation, you would have the pertinent committee, the agriculture committee, and perhaps a subcommittee on tobacco or something within the agriculture committee. And so these are the three parts of the iron triangle. You have the congressional committee, in this case agriculture. You have the bureaucratic agency, the Department of Agriculture, perhaps the division on tobacco, a more specific division within that department. And then you have lobbyists and interest groups for the tobacco industry and farmers and so forth. So you can see in this particular example how the benefits go in all directions back and forth across, all three sides of the triangle. So again, you see how they would benefit one another, and this cozy relationship would continue, and all three parts would benefit. And so these political scientists who came up with this term are trying to show basically, how does government actually work behind the scenes? How do things get done inside the government? And so you see in this case, they switched the circles on us a little bit, but you have, for instance, the subcommittees, like we said, are making the laws. If you see that bottom line, they're making the laws that affect tobacco farmers and tobacco industry interests. And so they, of course, the tobacco interest groups are giving money to these legislators, contributing money to probably both Democrats and Republicans who serve on the Agriculture Committee, to make sure that they grease the wheel for all of those people. And they're also providing them with useful information, statistics and things that they can bring back to their constituents. Likewise, the bureaucratic agency is helping these farmers and so forth with their actual problems. And they're the ones making regulations. So maybe they make more favorable regulations to the tobacco industry, and you also have them helping constituents. So when farmers call the Department of Agriculture and have a complaint, tobacco farmers, hey, we don't like this new regulation or something, the bureaucratic agency, would be the ones to respond to that or help them with some paperwork that they need to fill out that they don't understand or something like that. And like Mr. Davila said, the Congressional subcommittee is giving more money to that agency so that they can do a better job. And so it's just this mutually beneficial relationship. So you can look at this in more detail. And so who ends up benefiting from this? You see the interest groups, the members of Congress as they get reelected and get lots of money for their campaigns. The federal employees who keep their jobs because their agency is funded by Congress. And, but notice who is not part of this iron triangle. Who is not benefiting or who is left out of the decision-making process. And that is the people, right? The people. So so a lot of this stuff goes on behind the scenes, and we don't pay much attention to it. But if you're in the tobacco industry, if you're a tobacco farmer, if you're a lobbyist, of course, it's a great concern to you. So, again, a lot of this flies under the radar. And, of course, also you see some pork barrel legislation that could be passed to benefit these groups or these states and so forth. So, but the people are left out. So I'm not sure if we're going to get this in under 2 hours. We're trying to. So what can destroy the iron triangle? Well, the thing is, iron triangles sometimes it's an oversimplified way of looking at things. And so, it's a little more complicated than always looking at those three parts of a triangle. One thing that can hurt it or destroy it is divided government. So, for example, let's take, we mentioned the environmental regulations, right? Environmental regulations. So you might have lobbyists who are contributing, for who want, from the coal industry or the, oil industry and so forth, who are contributing, and these interest groups are extremely powerful. However, probably most of their contributions are going to Republican legislators. But what if you have a Democratic president who like Obama, who wanted to, sort of tighten regulations on the coal industry and on the energy companies and reduce pollution and, reduce the threats of climate change. And so if that happened, it could break up this cozy relationship, right? Because you might have Congress that would be favorable to the energy corporations and oil companies and so forth, but then you have a president, an executive branch that's not necessarily friendly to their interests, and they're more on the side of the environmental groups. And so you also have conflicting groups on all of these issues. So even in tobacco, you also would have you would have people who there's interest groups who fight for more regulations on tobacco. So it kind of leaves out some of these other factors, and can be sometimes an oversimplification of how things work. But yet it's still something you guys need to know, and the AP or College Board still seems to like to ask about these types of things.
So as Mr. Phillips mentioned, this iron triangle, it's still important, I think, to at least get a sense for it's like a template, right? I mean, And so you have a basic idea of what kind of collusion went on. Now, it's morphed into what is now an issue network, as Mr. Phillips mentioned, that the relationships that exist maybe back in the day, right, were a little bit more simplified because there may not have been as many players. But as the economy diversified, as the number of groups formed increased, we have now what are called issue networks. And so these are loose, broad coalitions of interest groups and other interested parties that band together to advocate for a particular issue or cause. So, for example, you could have Google and Apple and other tech industries on some issues. They may band together. So you could see like Google and Yahoo and the search engines like band together when it came to regulating search engines, right? They would not want or would not have been in favor of putting further limitations on these search engines. But on other issues with respect to maybe monopolies or issues that deal with one entity having too much power influence in an area, you could see Yahoo and Google be on different sides of an issue, or any other different combinations like Samsung and Apple or others that are competitors. Sometimes they could be on the same side of an issue depending on what the issue is, and sometimes they're going to be on different sides of the issue depending again on what is being discussed. And so these groups constantly change and adapt, unlike the Iron Triangle, which generally stays static. So you'll see a lot more fluidity here, and look at the groups that are involved, not just interest groups, but we have activists as well. One of the things that come to mind here, and in this case was a good thing, I would argue, and that is the elimination of cash bail. That effort was started by activists and ultimately took off, and we see legislation now that is helping to eliminate sort of cash bail, whereby individuals would have to pay cash in order to stay out of being put in jail temporarily prior to their court hearing or proceedings. And that disproportionately affected poor people, as you can imagine. So this helped to over-criminalize poorer people. So ultimately activists took up this cause, and ultimately it's now made its way into legislation, and they successfully appealed to both Democrats and Republicans in large part with this issue. And so, but lawyers, and again, consultants, public relation experts, all of these groups or entities or individuals would be involved in helping get certain legislation across the finish line, so to speak.
So again, another thing to mention is these groups are often temporary, right? So they'll come together to achieve a certain goal, either to get a bill passed or to get a bill, make sure a bill is defeated, for example. And then once they've achieved their goal, that group may break up and a new issue network forms for the next issue that comes along. And that this also represents, like Mr. Davila said, both sides. Now, coalition is sort of an alliance, right? So it's often a temporary alliance. So for example, you might have a foreign trade deal or a new trade agreement that we might be entering into, but some groups are going to support it, like different business interests and so forth, and trade groups. But also on the other side, you'd have a coalition of, let's say, unions, like workers' unions, and also perhaps child advocacy groups who are trying to combat the child labor that might take place if you had foreign labor and so forth, and maybe environmental groups who fear the consequence because these countries where the work is going to be done don't have the same environmental protection. And so you'd have these different groups coming together to oppose the same piece of legislation. Mr. Davila was taking confused.
So here we have the Hatch Act. In other words, because I really love the original, the wording for the Hatch Act was an act to prevent pernicious political activities, I believe. And I love that term. You know how I love words, so you should be looking up the word pernicious. If you haven't figured it out already, it's not a good thing. But the point of the matter is that the Hatch Act was passed to ensure that federal employees would not be biased. In other words, if you recall the impersonality component of the bureaucracy? Well, the Hatch Act is there, frankly, to reinforce this, to make certain that federal employees are not unduly influenced by or indeed promoting certain political views and carrying out their responsibilities. And now, if you haven't already looked up pernicious, it means causing insidious harm or ruin, injurious or hurtful. So it's definitely not a good thing, right? It's a negative thing. But nonetheless, the point of the matter is, again, to make sure that the federal employees are not acting in a biased or prejudiced manner and or are not trying to forward or promote a particular agenda. So the restrictions were later loosened by the Federal Employees Political Activities Act because Congress essentially realized, look, federal employees certainly are not supposed to be political or biased, but they are individuals, and so we believe and trust that they are professionals, and professionals are able to carry out their responsibilities in an impartial way. But in their personal lives, they're also able to sort of, be an active citizen because that's a virtuous thing. And so they loosened some of these restrictions. They allowed federal employees to run in nonpartisan elections.
5 seconds till 2 hours.
And also,
not gonna make
and
it.
also contribute to political campaigns in terms of money. But beyond that, there are still these limitations with respect to involving themselves in politics or political issues or gatherings, although there has been controversy in the past year, couple years really, where some members have actually attended what are considered political rallies. And so there's a real question here. But you'll hear this term Hatch Act being brought up frequently whenever we have these kind of conflicts.
All right, sorry guys, I was going to get you in under 2 hours.
Oh,
but
whatever. He was contributing
don't blame me.
Uh-huh.
All right, so
blame him too.
The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, as it's sometimes called. So this act was passed to open up government to provide, allow the public or media, you can imagine reporters who want information, to get more information, to request information from the government. Now, there are, sometimes they're called open records laws or sunshine laws, to shine the light on what government's doing behind the scenes. But what government often does, as you can see by the cartoon here, what they do is they often classify certain documents, and so that would be an exception to when they would have to release it. If it's classified document, then people can't request it. In many cases, although eventually it could be declassified, but you can see how they use that term redacted. So even if they release something, they may do redactions, and you see all the stuff that would be crossed out, which essentially takes away the significance or the meaning of it. So that's some criticism, but it's still been an important law in opening up the government and allowing better reporting by reporters and more information to reach the public. Even regular citizens can request certain documentation to figure out how a law was crafted behind the scenes and so forth. But there are exceptions. So if it's someone's personnel records, or obviously you can't request like someone's healthcare records from the government, but mainly it comes into play with things that are classified. But sometimes the government over-classifies things in order to keep it from the public.
All right, so now we're going to summarize the pros and cons of the bureaucracy. So, what are some of the good things of the bureaucracy? Well, we know that they are essential in implementing the laws, making the rules and clarifying the laws. In other words, making the laws operational, make them come to life. And that requires a lot of expertise and technical know-how in some cases, or in a lot of cases, to do that. And so that's really important in order to make sure that ultimately these laws are operational and that the government, by extension, is somewhat functional. And we can see here that they also are instrumental in delivering the services and benefits to the people. So to that extent that they are indeed the intermediaries that allow for certain services or benefits to get to you, that is also a virtuous thing. And finally, they enforce the laws and act as regulators so that indeed there is uniformity in application of the law, perhaps, but also that these laws are being respected and obeyed, such that we don't find regular violations. And remember that the lack of enforcement of laws really undermines the legitimacy of government. So the fact that laws are indeed being enforced and regulations being carried out means that the legitimacy of government is indeed strong or stronger. Ultimately, and here on the bad side, we know that the bureaucracy is a very large entity and it's very confusing. It also has, in some cases, excessive red tape. In other words, while these rules and regulations help to make laws operational, the quantity or the sheer amount of rules and regulations can also be an impediment to people being able to get the services and benefits that they want. It's also very hard to fire people, and therefore, since these people are unelected, that really stresses sort of the need, right, to have some sort of process in place where we can more easily hold individuals within the bureaucracy accountable to sort of prevent, if you will, inefficiencies or anything that would be untoward, or corruption, failures in the system, or simply someone's just not holding up their what they're asked or tasked with doing. And then we have the bureaucracy may not implement the laws well due to fragmentation. Remember the multiple agencies or departments that may be involved in the implementation of the law, lack of clarity, of course, as well, and ultimately lack of resources due to budget cuts. So all of these things can then mean that certain operations are not happening at an optimum level and therefore are inefficient and creating issues with respect to people being able to get the services, or government just frankly operating the way it needs to in order to be functional and indeed of service to the people. And that concludes the presentation.